What do the New Orleans Saints need to do to be a playoff team in 2022? Which New Orleans Saints players should you invest highly in when it comes to fantasy football? And what do we think about this 2022 NFL draft class? We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into this Friday episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always. Make it Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we are free and available on all platforms, including on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter. You can find me over on USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. On today's episode, we're getting the national perspective, the fantasy outlook, and the draft outlook on the New Orleans Saints with all the helpful folks here at the Locked On Podcast Network. So this is operating as an opportunity to show you what we have to offer here in terms of our national talent across the NFL and across the Locked On Podcast Network, but also give you all the information that you need around your New Orleans Saints from several different angles this off season. So we're going to start off with Brian Peacock of the Peacock and Williamson NFL show, our flagship NFL show here on the network. His thoughts on Jameis Winston, what has to go right, and the dynamic duo that needs to perform in order for the New Orleans Saints to be a playoff team in 2022. It's Brian Peacock at BD Peacock over at, of course, the Locked On 49ers podcast, but also the Peacock and Williamson NFL show. If you're looking for a show that covers the entire league with really, really good detail, minutia, everything you need to know, Brian Peacock, Matt Williamson, former NFL scout, these guys do it like nobody else. So Brian was nice enough to come through and join today for Locked On Saints to talk a little bit about these New Orleans Saints. And Brian, let's just start off with the general here. How you feeling about the New Orleans Saints after all the additions that they've made so far this offseason?
Well, first, Ross, I got to say, I appreciate you inviting me on, and I know we must be deep into the offseason. Look down your Rolodex and went all the way to the Peacock section. You're like, okay, let's have Peacock on the show today. No, but I appreciate it. And the Saints are a fascinating team to me because I know they're not one of the bad teams in the NFL. There's just way too much talent across the roster, but they also have some big questions about what's the high end there. And so I can't wait to see how it all comes together. And I always say, and we talk about this all the time on the Peacock and Williamson NFL show, and I kind of geek out on roster building, and it's all about the marriage of head coach and quarterback. And those are the two questions I have with the Saints, because you lose Sean Payton. I don't think you can overstate how important he was to the franchise. Right. And I know that there's a lot of, there's at least some consistency there with the coaching staff, but he's still not there. So that's going to be really fun to watch and see how that all comes together. And, Jameis Winston was really good in a small sample last year. And, clearly he was the number one overall pick for a reason, and there's talent there. So he's not like some journeyman quarterback, but how good is he? And is he good enough to elevate above a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the same division that obviously is a team you have to beat with maybe the greatest quarterback of all time. So it's fascinating, but a ton of talent as well in the team. So I'm interested to see how it looks, probably just as interested as those Saints fans out there, but I think they're going to be good. And I think they're going to be right in it again as a playoff team, because the one thing I'm not sure about is the high level, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to fall apart. They're going to be, sure. They're just too talented not to be a decent football team. So yeah. I like them battling for one of those wild card spots.
Yeah, look, I don't blame Saints fans at all for the confidence in Jameis Winston, particularly when it comes to the conversation around playing against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, considering they lost to Trevor Siemian and Taysom Hill last year. So, I mean, at this point, as long as you can get the ball downfield, which the Saints struggled to do last year, but now this year going into 2022, they've added these weapons. Michael Thomas is expected to be back. They draft Chris Olave. They add Jarvis Landry. How do those additions over on the offensive side make you sort of look, do they make you look at this New Orleans Saints offense a little bit differently than maybe the band that you saw last year?
Yeah, I love what's around Jameis Winston there on offense. It's really hard to know where Michael Thomas is. I mean, he should be really healthy and spry, right? Because he hasn't played a lot of football, but how much rust is there on top of it? I mean, it's been so long. When's the last time he even caught a pass, right? And who was that quarterback? And it was a different coach. So it seems like an eternity ago that Michael Thomas was on the field and making an impact for those New Orleans Saints. And real quick, as it pertains to the quarterback and Jameis Winston, and I know we're kind of talking about 2022, but one of the big questions I have with them is giving up future picks and still having that uncertainty at quarterback, because I'm pretty sure it's going to go okay, but okay is not enough. If I'm an NFL GM, I want more. And so if they find out they need to look for more at quarterback, well, they don't have that first round pick next year. So do you find another way to get a pick or a quarterback, or do you have to wait another year? Then you draft a guy. Then you're talking about, okay, well, maybe we'll develop a guy by 2015. That's a long time from now. So I think they really put a lot of their eggs in this, no Sean Payton, let's go with Jameis Winston basket. And that worries me into the future, even though I do like a lot of the pieces in their roster is good enough to win now.
I wonder how much of it has to do actually with Sean Payton. The idea that he would potentially return next season. And then if he were to take a job with whichever team will be interested in him, we heard, earlier this week that the Miami Dolphins were reportedly ready to give him 5 years, $100 million. Yeah. If that's the case, the Saints, they have to trade his rights away. So I wonder how much of the aggressiveness with those future picks is kind of banking on the idea of Sean Payton just stepping away for a year and coming back next year and maybe recouping a first round pick that way.
Yeah, and the Saints have always been that galaxy brain team where you're like, what the heck are you doing? And then a year later, they're like, oh, there's this and this in place to change this. And you're like, okay, well, they're just playing a different game anyways. Talking about they're trying to figure out what they're doing.
Yeah, they do a lot of weird, wacky stuff. That seems to be becoming normal, a little bit more normal now when you look at like the Rams and the Packers doing some good stuff too. So, everybody's figuring out their way now to work around all this stuff with the expected skyrocketing salary cap and all that that's on the way. And a lot of that money that the Saints have invested over the past few years has been over on the defensive side. They lose Marcus Williams this offseason. Malcolm Jenkins retires to replace him with Tyrann Mathieu, the hometown kid, as well as Marcus Maye from the New York Jets, another 2017 safety draft class guy, just like Marcus Williams. How are you feeling about that New Orleans Saints defense? And do you feel like the additions that they've made help to bandage up some of the losses that they had over the offseason?
Yes, absolutely. And, when you consider, I love how they've put the rest of the roster together, because they have specific players that fit specific roles at different levels, right? You have Jarvis Landry, who's that tough slot guy, short depth of target, exactly what he's going to be. Chris Olave, they needed the downfield guy, so they target the best downfield receiver and come in and play right away in their offense. And then Michael Thomas, who's the intermediate guy, and slant boy, as he was once called. But and so you can it's really obvious to see how those three receivers come together. You look at their defensive backfield, and they've I love how they replaced Williams with Marcus Maye. He's a really good player, really underrated player, just because he's playing in New York with the Jets. And so you have him on one level. Tyrann Mathieu is a do everything guy who can play close to the line of scrimmage, but can also move around. You can use him as a chess piece. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson's been one of my favorite defensive backs for a while, since he was at Florida. And I love him. And I think the national media and Latin fans, casual fans, or hardcore NFL fans that don't know a lot about the Saints probably don't realize how much Saints fans probably really like Gardner-Johnson. They just know that their own team's receivers don't like Gardner-Johnson. I think it's a good thing, right, for the Saints. And so he's a unique piece as well than Lattimore on the outside. And I love what they did in the draft last year with Paulson coming over from Stanford. There's a really good player in PJ Williams. So a lot of depth. The secondary is obviously the strength of their team, but they still have Demario Davis, who's just a stud of a player. And I think they'll be able to get after the quarterback enough, even though that would be probably where I'm a little bit worried. You need to see that next step from Payton Turner and some of those players. And I'm very familiar with Kentavious Street, who's kind of just a rotational guy. So as long as that comes together, the defense has a chance to be really scary. And again, got very specific players on every level of the defense. And that's probably what's going to carry this team. Yeah,
and that's kind of become their kind of identity maybe since 2017, is all of a sudden they started, the sort of diminishing arm strength of Drew Brees, and all of a sudden they became a defensive team, and it looks like they've been able to keep that together. We'll see how that ends up benefiting over on the offensive side as well. You and Matt over at the Peacock and Williamson NFL show, our flagship NFL show here on the Locked On Podcast Network, had the New Orleans Saints ranked as in terms of power rankings of the NFC, kind of 7th seed. What needs to go right for the New Orleans Saints this year in order to make sure that they land there, but also how fragile is that positioning, if at all?
It's not fragile going down, because there's just too much talent. There's talent everywhere. And even losing their star left tackle, you replace him with Trevor Penning, and we'll see how quickly he's able to come up to speed. He's not going to be Armstead, definitely not right away. Right. But, they have McCoy, and you drafted Cesar Ruiz high, and Pete, and, just a ton of former first-round picks, just a ton of talent on the offensive line. As long as Alvin Kamara is not in trouble and getting suspended or getting hurt, you're going to be fine there. A little thunder and lightning with Mark Ingram. So I love their ability to run the ball, a little play action. We already know what Jameis Winston can do, pushing the ball down the field. So to me, it's the coach and the quarterback, and how high can they elevate the team. If they're just okay, and it's just like, okay, we have a quarterback and our coach isn't, completely, blowing games for us, they're going to be fine. And they're going to be, fighting for one of those wild card spots. This is not a team that's going to be a disaster unless there's something unforeseen with injuries or something crazy like that. But again, coach, quarterback has to go really right for them to elevate to the point where I think they're, potentially having a bye in the playoffs this year.
Yeah. Not a question that a lot of Saints fans are used to having to ask about the coach and the quarterback. This is a little bit of kind of new territory for a lot of Saints fans.
You start to realize how the rest of the league lives when you have Drew Brees and Sean Payton for that long. You're like, oh, this isn't always that easy. And it's hard to find those two positions. That's why they're so important. That's why the marriage of coach and quarterback is the thing to have in the NFL.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a big 2022 for the New Orleans Saints, big 2022 all around the National Football League. Training camp right around the corner. Mini camps wrapping up. Great place to keep up with all of it. Peacock and Williamson NFL show. Brian, appreciate you so much for taking the time to come through on today's Locked On Saints. Appreciate the insight, buddy.
I love you, buddy. Anytime. Appreciate it.
Y'all saw I had to get Brian with the Trevor Siemian and Taysom Hill wins over Tampa Bay, didn't you? I know you saw that. I know you liked that one. All right, so big thank you to Brian for coming on the show. We'll be seeing him a little bit later throughout training camp as well, and I'm sure I'll be over at the Peacock and Williamson NFL show. But seriously, go and check that show out. Such phenomenal insight and work from those guys. NFL analyst Brian Peacock, NFL insider, as well as former NFL scout in Matt Williamson. Just a ton of great stuff over there. Coming up next, which New Orleans Saints should you be investing in when it comes to fantasy football this season? Some drafts right around the corner. Those of you that are in dynasty leagues, Chris Olave, is he somebody you should be taking a look at here soon? We're going to break all that down with Vinnie Iyer of the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast here in just a moment. Before we get to that, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, the number one source for all of your sports wagering information and sports wagering needs, our official online gambling partners here on the Locked On Podcast Network. You can check them out day or night, wherever it is that you are, whether you check out from your mobile device or your laptop, and get all of the updated trends in action that you need. You want win totals for all the teams across the NFL, with the exception of the Cleveland Browns, because nobody knows who their quarterback is actually going to be in 2022. You can check that out over at betonline.net. You can also see everything else that they have going on in terms of offensive rookie of the year odds, defensive rookie of the year odds, MVP odds, end of year awards, whole bunch of NFL stuff, NBA, MLB, NHL, even esports. They've got everything for you over there at BetOnline. So go ahead, get in on the action today at BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks so much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget about our listener survey over at lockedonpodcasts.com/survey. It gives you an opportunity to tell us what you like, what you don't like about the Locked On Podcast Network, what we can do more of, what you're loving. So go and check that out today and give us your thoughts. We'll also enter you in an opportunity to be one of 10 folks to win a $100 Ticketmaster gift card as well. So go check it out, lockedonpodcasts.com/survey. All right, now we are joined by Vinnie Iyer of the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. He's going to break down who you should be taking a look at and who you should be trusting when it comes to the New Orleans Saints offense, and even how valuable their defense could be this season. All right, Vinnie, thank you so much for joining Locked On Saints today. We appreciate you coming on to give us a little bit of that fantasy advice, that fantasy expertise. I want to start off here with the quarterback, Jameis Winston, a new band of characters for him. He's got an offseason to finally have an offense built around him and a new offensive coordinator looking to build that offense specifically for him. No competition with Taysom Hill, anything like that. How does that impact the fantasy outlook for New Orleans Saints quarterback, Jameis Winston, in your eyes?
I think Jameis Winston falls into the QB2 with some intrigue here for 2022. He's in that Jared Goff category. Are we interested in that? Are we interested in whoever wins the Steelers job there, whether Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett? It's all about the weapons, and you look at the weapons, they're pretty good, and the aggressive downfield nature, which we've been promised from the Saints offense here in the transition from Sean Payton. And there's also, right, you mentioned Taysom Hill. There's not that wrinkle of a guy coming in to get key snaps and steal the touches and make this into a run-heavier offense. So I think it's a wait-and-see approach. I think Jameis Winston will have some value at some point, given the upgraded receiving core. You can't deny that. But it might be matchup-based, and we want to settle in a little bit with him. We want to see, is he still moving around well, coming off that knee injury? Is he going to feel it more in this offense now that he's had basically 3 years to absorb it? I know it's without Sean Payton, but the system and the guys around him are pretty much similar with an upgrade here in the receiving core. So I think Jameis Winston, there are elements and ingredients around Winston that you'd think he could be successful as a fantasy quarterback, but I think you want to see it a little bit to believe it here, and he might have some value at mid-season.
Yeah, I want to see exactly how maybe the early portion of the season goes before fully pulling the trigger on, this is the QB1 and I'm riding with him the whole way. When you look at the ingredients that you mentioned, specifically at wide receiver, just thinking about the fantasy outlook for guys like Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, now rookie Chris Olave, what's the value for these guys and how are they impacted with Jameis Winston at the helm as opposed to, let's say, a Drew Brees or last year where you had 4 quarterbacks starting for them?
Yeah, essentially it's rebooting the whole wide receiver core, right? I mean, Michael Thomas was not a factor, and all of a sudden you have Chris Olave and Jarvis Landry in there, and now Marquez Callaway is a complementary receiver. We were looking for sleeper things out of Marquez Callaway, and he flashed quite a bit last year as a downfield threat, and really their only reliable wideout there that they could look at any kind of regularity, and he had a few nice fantasy games there. But now you blow this whole thing up, you have different guys in there. It's going to be interesting to see how the targets are distributed between these three. And with the Jarvis Landry acquisition, it was a bit head scratching in the fantasy community because Michael Thomas often uses the big slot. You can use Marquez Callaway on the outside as a complementary big play threat. We know that Chris Olave can be special as well. So you put all these guys in the mix. Are there enough balls to go around all of a sudden? We went from not sure of who was going to be thrown to are there too many guys catching balls? So that doesn't include Alvin Kamara, we know consistently being a massive target out of the backfield. So there are a lot of things to navigate, but as I tell a lot of people who question where you should go in fantasy football, follow the talent. And I look at Chris Olave's talent and Michael Thomas's talent. Those are still pretty higher. Jarvis Landry is on the tail end of his career here. They might cut down on Alvin Kamara's usage because they have these receivers and want to be a little bit more aggressive with Jameis Winston. But right now, I think if you look at Olave and Thomas for different leagues, I think if you're looking at half point or full PPR, I think Thomas will still get the volume. Sure. But maybe in standard leagues, Chris Olave can develop into that ideal number one deep threat for Jameis Winston.
If you're in a really deep league and let's say, you have, a ton of different teams, maybe a 12-team league or something like that, and you're looking for a late wide receiver, where do some of the guys that started last year that are now going to be complementary guys like Marquez Callaway, as well as Deontay Harris last year, now Deontay Hardy, do those guys kind of factor in if you need a late sleeper at some point?
Yeah, I still wouldn't totally figure that Callaway's out of the mix here. I mean, Winston has some chemistry with him. Remember, he doesn't have any season-long chemistry with any of these other guys, but we saw it in last year's preseason. Marquez Callaway was buzzing. He was making the big plays here with Winston. So you figure he's going to be a factor because of what he can do. And Olave might need some time. I mean, he's a great talent from Ohio State, but still to put it all together as a elevated number one receiver in this offense, it might be a little bit difficult. And you could see Michael Thomas being more of the possession guy, kind of getting reintroduced, so to speak, into an offense without Payton. So I think Callaway will have more value than people think. I think what this does with that depth at wide receiver pretty much makes you want to pivot away from the backup Taysom Hill and anyone at tight end here. I think it's going to be a wide receiver-centric offense here, whether you have the 11 personnel or even stretch the field 4 wide.
Yeah, the tight end room was one that was a little disappointing last year. It's a big question mark this year. So I would have to agree with that assessment that maybe these wide receivers now kind of make you back off at tight end a bit. But does it have the same impact for a guy like Alvin Kamara, who has been, a fantasy staple, a top 5 selection in a lot of fantasy drafts, depending upon the structure of the league and everything? Does that do these new wide receivers impact Alvin Kamara's value as well, in addition to the potential suspension, of course, but without knowing about that, obviously, at this time?
Yeah, it's a hard guide to navigate through the top 5 at running back here, whether you're in standard or leaning toward PPR. I think Alvin Kamara is still going to be on the radar in terms of top 5, top end RB1 for a lot of leagues here. So I think you weigh him against the other guys. Christian McCaffrey, he's got the injury history that may shy some people away from him for sure. Dalvin Cook, I think, was a guy that you'd feel really comfortable about. Then you have Derrick Henry coming off the foot injury, and is he going to break down at some point with all the volume he's had? So it's tough to navigate through those early picks, but I look at Alvin Kamara. When he gets the ball, all he does is produce. And he's not going to go away as a key thing that they do in this offense. It just may be a little different and might be a little bit more rushing production than we've seen in the past from him and come out that way. But again, when you stretch the field and you're aggressive, you got to throw to someone on check downs, and if you're under pressure a little bit, and you might have that a little bit because Tyrann Mathieu's not there. Trevor Penning might need some time. Might not have the same pass protection you're used to if you're Jameis Winston. So getting the ball out quickly, I think, will be a factor, and Kamara's not going to go away there. They're very aware of his skill set. It's not like they've completely changed offensive systems where it's a newcomer coming in and trying to adjust to Kamara's skill set. They know exactly what he can do and why he's important to this offense.
Absolutely. Jameis Winston's big focus this offseason, as he's been coming back from that ACL injury, is throwing within, the behind the line of scrimmage, within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage, because he hasn't been able to push the ball further downfield than that for the majority of the offseason. So I don't think you're going to lose a lot of production in terms of what the New Orleans Saints focus is with Alvin Kamara. Lastly, to wrap up, there's been a little bit of a kind of identity shift for the New Orleans Saints. A lot of people now consider them a defensive team. Where does that DST rank if you're looking at a standard league and you're considering maybe even drafting the New Orleans Saints or maybe going after them off of waivers?
Yeah, they do have a lot of big potential here without even Marcus Williams. They brought in different safeties there to hopefully raise the playmaking quotient. When you do that with Tyrann Mathieu, you're going to have chances to go after the quarterback out of blitzes and guy in the back end that's just going to be active around the ball. And we know this defense, and with Dennis Allen taking over, it's the backbone of this team. It's the part that has carried them for quite a while now. And really, as the offense has dwindled here with Drew Brees' arm strength and making the transition post Brees. So, yeah, they can definitely attack. I mean, they have the pass rushers here. I think they can make up a little bit for that Trey Hendrickson pass rush that they didn't do as well last year. So that's going to help getting those sacks. So you're looking for sacks and takeaways. If you're looking at a defense, at least I'll say this from a fantasy football perspective, they get to play Carolina and Atlanta twice each.
So really good point.
They're playing. I wouldn't say you're going to invest in them to play against Tampa, but they've actually had some really great games against Tom Brady as well. So, yeah, so that makes you feel confident that the Saints are not going to lose too much here. Allen's probably going to have a little bit of distraction here overseeing the whole team, but he's going to keep that defensive mentality going.
Absolutely. Vinnie Iyer at Vinnie Iyer on Twitter Sporting News, as well as, of course, every Monday through Friday over at Locked On Fantasy Football, giving you everything you need to be ready for the fantasy football season. Vinnie, thanks so much for taking the time to come through on today's Locked On Saints.
Yep, no problem, Ross. Have a good one.
All right, one more big thank you to Sporting News Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinnie Iyer for coming through. We're going to visit with him again as the drafts and the season gets a little bit closer and everything as well, so that we can kind of rehash and kind of get some updates as well as training camp rolls along and all of that. So big thank you to Vinnie for that insight. Coming up next, what do the New Orleans Saints need to do, these rookies, particularly at the top of the class, Chris Olave, Trevor Penning, what do they need to do their rookie season to maybe be considered a success sooner rather than later? You really want to wait 3 years, or do you want to be a success now? Eric Crocker of the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast joins us to break it all down. And before we get Eric up in here, I want to tell you about our friends over at rockauto.com. Eric rocks, and so does Rock Auto. That's the segue. Rock Auto really, truly is amazing, though. I mean, you save a ton of money by heading over to rockauto.com. You follow their easy-to-navigate catalog, your make, your model, your year, what part, piece, or accessory you're looking for, and you're going to get a bunch of options for whatever that part, piece, or accessory is, and you're going to end up saving yourself from having to pay 30, 50, 70, sometimes 100% more than what you would pay over at Rock Auto because you went to one of those chain stores where they're going to upcharge you because you're a do-it-yourselfer. Just because you're not a wholesale person, just because you're not a professional, who cares? Everybody's got to work on their car. Everyone's car should be able to drive well. And if you're able to get some of that work done, why pay an arm and a leg for it? Instead, head over to rockauto.com where they're not going to upcharge you like that. And they've got support to help you 24/7. They're a family business. They've been helping online customers for over 20 years. There's nobody better. Head over to rockauto.com today. Grab whatever you need. Don't forget to write Locked On in the How'd You Hear About Us section so that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, and all the parts your car will ever need at rockauto.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode with Eric Crocker of the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. He's here to talk a bit about Chris Olave, Trevor Penning, Alontae Taylor, DeMarco Jackson, Jordan Jackson, his thoughts on the draft class, and what the top 3 guys need to do to be considered a success sooner rather than later. Here's Eric. Eric, my brother, thank you so much for taking the time to join this episode of Locked On Saints, talk about the New Orleans Saints draft class. Eric Crocker, of course, of Locked On NFL Draft, as well as Locked On 49ers as well. But he's coming through as our resident draft expert here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Let's start a little general here. We'll open up wide, and then we'll kind of come down and kind of focus down a little bit on some of these other guys. But the New Orleans Saints, Chris Olave, Trevor Penning, Alontae Taylor, Demarco Jackson, Jordan Jackson, 5-player draft class. What are your overall thoughts on what the New Orleans Saints did in the NFL draft this year?
I think overall, right away, especially when you have multiple swings in the first round, they got guys that are going to come in and play right now. So to be able to get a guy like Chris Olave, which a lot of people were like, oh, they're going to go receiver. And they did. And not only did they go receiver, I think like it felt like a need, but it was a position that they just really bolstered it. When you look at what they already have at the receiver position, then adding Jarvis, Landry to obviously Michael Thomas, and then now Chris Olave, I feel like he's a very complete group. And he was kind of the final piece to that puzzle. Well, technically Jarvis Landry, because he was the last one. But essentially, when you look at that trio of receiver groups, you feel really confident with that. And then needing to get better. You were talking about needing the offensive line. Then they go and get Trevor Penning, a guy like him who I think overall a lot of guys are like, oh, well, there's a little bit of refinement that needs to be had there, but he has a nasty, mean streak. He's
the word you always hear about, a mean streak.
And you see it, and he takes that on. I feel like there are a lot of guys, right, when you think of the movie, Dark Knight, and that's everybody's favorite Batman movie. And it's like, well, why? And it's like, well, the Joker, he was so great. And everyone loves a great villain. And I think Trevor Penning, he's kind of that villain. And he takes on that role very well. But, when you watch him and some of the things he does, like extras, like he likes to antagonize defensive linemen. It would annoy the heck out of me. But when he's on your side, I think that's the kind of guy that you really love.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like a little CJ Gardner-Johnson on the offensive line, though, which is, you take a little bit of fun.
Exactly. And we've seen so many altercations that Gardner-Johnson has gotten into, but definitely a player who, when he's on your team, you love him. And I think the great thing about guys like that, whether it's Trevor Penning, from what I've seen so far from him, and also like Gardner-Johnson, that confidence, it doesn't waver. Like they're always that guy. And I think there's something about that you have to really like.
Yeah, and I think confidence in a DB, confidence in the offensive line, that's two places where maybe outside of quarterback, confidence might be most important, because you lose some of those reps, right? But you got to live to fight the next down.
Right. And you go into it knowing you're not going to win every rep. And now you'll have the fans where it's like, man, you just got beat for a touchdown. Why are you still talking? It's like, no. You want to keep that same energy. You want to keep that level because, you're not going to win every rep. And when you're an offensive lineman, everyone sees when you get beat. When you're a cornerback, everyone sees when you get beat. But when you're doing your job for the other 70 plays of a game, nobody talks about that. So I think you always have to keep that energy. Those two guys, I think they're going to.
There's a guy that the Saints drafted this year, Alontae Taylor, the cornerback, let's say defensive back, but who looks like he's going to be competing at corner with New Orleans out of Tennessee. Cody Burns, the New Orleans Saints wide receiver coach, referred to him as the number one, sort of public enemy number one in one-on-ones during OTAs. You're a former NFL, AFL cornerback. What does it mean, just in terms of the tenacity of a defensive back, when you have the wide receiver coach throwing him praise like that?
I would say he's a guy that he might be giving it to the receivers a little bit, and not just with his play, probably with his mouth as well, right? Like, essentially kind of making himself a target. But guys that make themselves a target, like they enjoy that. They enjoy having that target in their back, and they enjoy the competition, the back and forth. There's probably a lot of that going on. And, coaches, once, especially if they're a receiver coach, and they show some, I guess kind of, you can almost say praise to a younger guy in that way, he's definitely doing something that is standing out. So that's awesome. And for Alontae Taylor, he was a guy on draft night. We're like, okay, is he going to play corner? Is he going to play safety? Where are they going to play him at? There was, they drafted him to be safety. Then no, actually, I think that he's going to play cornerback. And I remember watching him and thinking, gosh, he reminds me a lot of Jalen Johnson, who played at
Chicago
Utah.
Bears.
Chicago Bears. And Jalen Johnson, he was a guy who I wasn't necessarily high on, not as high on him as other guys, but as it pertained like to the rookie class, when he was coming that year, nobody really played better than him as a rookie. Right? On the grading scale, you look at the grades and everything like that, his game translated to the NFL extremely well, and he had a very well-rounded game. They did a lot of different things with him at Utah, and now you look at Alontae Taylor, who, again, I watch him, I see a similar type player, and I almost fixed my mouth to be like, oh, I don't really care for him. No, wait a minute. This is Jalen Johnson all over again. And you know what? I'm going to say, this time it's going to work out because of maybe I don't necessarily care for the overall just pure movement skills of him. It maybe not be as fluid, but it works for him. And as it sounds right now, going through OTAs, sound like it's working for Alontae Taylor as well.
Yeah, he's having a good time so far in OTAs. We'll see if he's able to compete during minicamp, training camp, and where he ends up working himself in. You and Ryan Tracy over at Locked On NFL Draft re-ranked the wide receiver class based upon the situation that they were drafted into, which, by the way, I thought was a genius exercise. Not to be biased, I think it's a genius exercise, but you guys also both put Chris Olave in at number 1. What is it about the situation that he was drafted into that makes him maybe at the top of his class so far projecting into 2022?
I think the quarterback position, and there's some projecting that goes with that as well. But Jameis Winston, for everything that he's not, one thing he is, he's a gunslinger. He's going to let it rip. He's going to throw to all levels of the field. I know last year it felt like he started to play a little bit safer, but I want to see that gunslinger kind of come back. And if it does, we saw what he did with Tampa Bay, and I know everybody wants to talk about the 30 interceptions in one season. They don't talk about the 30 touchdowns as well.
Right.
Who's catching those touchdowns? Well, it's the receivers, and they're catching the ball downfield. And I think when you have a receiver like this, where you have, I got the guy that might be more of the target hog in Jarvis, Landry, and Mike Thomas. But who's that field stretcher? Who's the guy that's going to have those big plays? Who's that guy that might, you give a lot of attention to Mike Thomas. Okay, you might give a little bit to Jarvis Landry as well. Well, by the way, we have this third guy who maybe he can eat a little bit. If he can get 4 or 5 catches a game and maybe a big play here and there, stretching the field, end up with 8 touchdowns because he's catching the ball downfield and he's kind of an afterthought to the defense, I think that bodes well for him. And he has the quarterback that's going to be willing to do that. You look at some of these other receivers and some of the situations they went to. Drake London going to the Atlanta Falcons, and they have Mariota, and they have a rookie, and it's like, I don't know exactly what's going to happen there. Zach Wilson and Garrett Wilson, right? Garrett Wilson drafted to the New York Jets, and it's like, will Zach Wilson take that next step? Just a lot of question marks surrounding some of these other receivers. No question marks surrounding Jameis Winston, except for he's going to be healthy. And if he is healthy, I think he's going to hit the ground running. He's going to let it rip. He's a very smart and intelligent quarterback. So once he starts making, continuing to make just better decisions, I think he's going to help improve all the guys' numbers on that receiving core, including Chris Olave.
Yeah, and so far so good on the health front. I mean, the fact that he was a part of OTAs at all is kind of wild. So, we'll see what it looks like as training camp goes on. Last one for you here, Eric. Thanks again so much for taking the time to join us. Eric Crocker, former NFL, AFL cornerback, and of course, our draft expert here at the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. 5-person draft class. We kind of mentioned DeMarco Jackson, Jordan Jackson, kind of just got to see what happens with them over on the defensive side. But it feels like this draft class is going to be deemed successful or unsuccessful based upon the 2 first-round picks, Chris Olave and Trevor Penning. Is that an accurate assessment? And what do these guys need to do to become successful sooner rather than later?
Well, a lot of times it's the guys that you don't really expect to make a huge contribution. But I mean, Jackson out of Appalachian State, right? Linebacker.
Yep.
I mean, that's the guy that is fast downhill. I mean, tested extremely well. One thing I was watching him and I'm like, okay, moving backwards, it looks a little iffy, but man, when he's coming downhill, when he's running side to side, he's closing with bad intentions. And that's the guy playing next to a tremendous linebacker in Double D, Demario Davis, right? Who, I actually was on the Jets with Demario Davis, right?
Right.
That's the guy he's going to learn from one of the more underrated linebackers in all of the NFL. So, that's a guy right there where maybe, let's say, hypothetically speaking, you don't hit on one of the early guys, which more times than not, that's what's going to happen. He might be the guy that kind of changes the fortune of this entire draft class.
That's a really, really fantastic point. So maybe it's one of the sleeper guys toward the end that's there. But hey, you mentioned Chris Olave getting 8 touchdowns. I don't think any Saints fan would be mad if that happened his rookie year. Eric Crocker, Locked On NFL Draft. You can follow him on Twitter at Eric_Crocker. Appreciate you coming through, homie. I'll see you here soon.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
All right, family. One more big thank you to Eric Crocker over from the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast, Locked On 49ers as well. Former NFL player, former AFL cornerback. I mean, the guy's incredible. So great to get his insight there, especially about Alontae Taylor being that public enemy number 1 when it comes to one-on-ones as described by Cody Burns. So really cool stuff there, and really, really appreciate all 3 of our guests for coming through on this Friday episode On Monday's episode, we're going to be taking a look back at minicamp, but also throughout the week, we're going to break down some of your big questions that you have sent me so far this offseason. Offensive players and defensive players looking to take a step forward in 2022. The 3 players with the most pressure on them this season, as well as even taking a look at second, third year guys. Who's going to be taking that big leap moving forward in 2022? So there's a ton to break down, and I appreciate you so much for making me a daily listen here on the Locked On Saints podcast, for making us your first listen of the day every day. Make sure you go and check out that Locked On NFL podcast as well. All the news around the league that you need in less than 30 minutes. Go and check them out wherever you get this podcast and on YouTube as well. I appreciate you as always making me a part of your day. I'll see you on Monday, if not sooner. If anything big happens, you know I'll be here. But see you at the very least on Monday. For everything you need in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.